on the nights of Broadway.
For a song to be a hit, it's gotta be good. For a song to go to #1 on the US Billboard Hot 100, it needs to be great. For one person to write or co-write 4 consecutive #1 hits, all for different artists, is a feat so unbelievable it has never been repeated in the 50 years since it happened. And at the center of it all was a man who wrote melodies that felt like they were sent from the heavens, and sang with a falsetto that could slice through glass. Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees. In the late 1970s, Barry wasn't just a pop star, he was a songwriting powerhouse. He was the kind of creator who could walk into a studio, listen to a producer's idea, and walk out with a future chart topper. But what made his run of success even more incredible was its speed, variety, and sheer cultural dominance. At one point, Barry had written or co-written 5 of the top 10 songs in the US simultaneously. How did one man, in a span of just months, pull off the most unmatched songwriting run in pop history? And what was the toll of living at the absolute peak of musical creation, where every note and every lyric had to be perfect? In 1977, the Bee Gees, made up of Barry, Robin, and Maurice, had already reinvented themselves once. They'd started in the 1960s as ballad-singing, Beatles-inspired rockers before fading into near irrelevance by the early 70s. But Barry always had a secret weapon: adaptability. When the disco movement began bubbling up in underground clubs, the Bee Gees' manager, Robert Stigwood, saw an opportunity. The band leaned into the groove, and Barry developed the now legendary falsetto he'd first experimented with on 1975's Nights on Broadway. The results were electric. By 1977, Barry's songwriting was in overdrive. The Bee Gees were already working on songs for what would become the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack when Stigwood approached them with a new idea: write for other artists under his management. The logic was simple: spread the Gibb magic around. It worked. First came You Should Be Dancing, followed by Love So Right. Then a flood of songs not just for the Bee Gees, but also for artists like Hugh Von Elliman, Samantha Sang, and Barry's younger brother, Andy Gibb. Still, no one could have predicted what would happen in early 1978, one after another. Songs written or co-written by Barry hit #1 in the US. They had different singers and different styles, but they all had the same signature touch. The streak wasn't a planned marketing stunt. It was simply the result of Barry writing songs so good and so perfectly tuned to the era that radio couldn't resist. It all started with Stayin Alive. In December 1977, as Saturday Night Fever exploded in theaters, its soundtrack began rewriting chart history. The Bee Gees already had How Deep Is Your Love at #1, but Stayin Alive was something else, a cultural detonation. Barry wrote the song with his brothers Robin and Maurice in a French chateau as part of a set of demos for the film. The drum track wasn't even live. It was a loop of drummer Dennis Bryan's performance from Night Fever, repeated endlessly to create that relentless disco heartbeat. The lyrics, with their swagger and defiance, came from Barry's fascination with survival in the urban grind. He later explained that it was about staying alive in the big city, and that the attitude had to match John Travolta's strut in the film's opening scene. When it hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in February 1978, it became the first of 4 consecutive chart toppers written or co-written by Barry. Here's the twist: the same week, Stayin Alive topped the chart. Another song he'd written was Climbing Fast, performed by someone else entirely. Could Barry really compete with himself at the top of the charts? The second hit came from the family. Andy Gibb, Barry's youngest brother, was just 20 years old and already a rising pop star. His debut single, I Just Want to Be Your Everything, also written by Barry, had been a smash. Now, his follow-up, Love Is Thicker Than Water, was set to take over. Barry had written the song in 1976 during a family trip to Bermuda. Andy was hesitant about recording it, feeling it might not match the energy of his first hit. Trust me, Barry reportedly told him. By March 1978, Love Is Thicker Than Water replaced Stayin Alive at #1, meaning Barry had effectively knocked himself off the top of the charts. For the music industry, this was unheard of. 2 different artists, 2 back back-to-back chart toppers, both from the same pen. But as Us Thicker Than Water dominated radio, something else Barry had written was already in motion. A song with a completely different feel for an artist outside the Gibb family. Could Barry's style survive beyond the Bee Gees' world? The third hit wasn't just big, it was defining. Night Fever wasn't initially meant to be the lead single from the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. The Bee Gees had written it after being inspired by a chord progression Barry heard while strumming in the studio. The track dripped with his signature falsetto, layered harmonies, and a groove that seemed to crystallize the entire disco era. Released as a single in February 1978, it climbed the charts quickly right as Love Is Thicker Than Water was peaking. By March, Night Fever had dethroned Andy's song, giving Barry his third consecutive #1 hit as a songwriter and making him the only person in history to replace himself at #1 twice in a row. The streak was now drawing industry-wide attention. Radio programmers joked they might as well rename the top 40 Barry's Countdown. And yet, another song was already knocking on the door. A ballad that would prove Barry could do more than disco. Could he slow down the beat and still keep the crown? The fourth and final blow in this historic streak was If I Can't Have You, performed by Wavon Elliman. The Bee Gees had written and recorded their own version for the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, but Robert Stigwood, ever the strategist, decided Elliman should record it to give the soundtrack more variety. Barry adapted the arrangement for her voice, smoothing out the falsetto edges and leaning into a passionate, almost pleading vocal delivery. The gamble paid off. Released in April 1978, the song shot to #1, replacing Night Fever and making it 4 consecutive Billboard Hot 100 #1 hits, all written or co-written by Barry Gibb. At the time, Billboard confirmed that no songwriter in history had achieved such a streak, and decades later, the record still stands. By now, Barry wasn't just dominating the charts, he was the charts. But with that dominance came a brewing backlash. Some rock critics began railing against disco, targeting the Bee Gees as the face of the genre. Certain radio stations allegedly reduced Bee Gees' airplay, fearing listeners were burning out. Barry knew the tide would turn eventually. It's impossible to be on top forever, he later admitted. Behind the glitter and the gold records, the streak took its toll. Barry was working almost without sleep, splitting time between writing for the Bee Gees, producing for other artists, and managing the media frenzy. The constant demand for perfection meant the joy of songwriting sometimes got lost in the grind. The Disco Demolition Night in Chicago in the summer of 1979, a riotous event where records were blown up on a baseball field, was a public rejection of disco, and the Bee Gees became collateral damage. Yet, the record Barry set in early 1978 survived the backlash. Even when the Bee Gees were pushed off U.S. radio playlists, no other songwriter could match that 4-in-a-row run. Why? Because it wasn't just about disco. It was about Barry's uncanny ability to tap into melody, emotion, and timing. His songs didn't simply follow a trend, they defined it. In later years, Barry would go on to write more hits for legends like Barbra Streisand, Dionne Warwick, and Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton. But nothing quite matched the sheer dominance of that 1978 streak. Industry veterans still call it the perfect storm. The right songs, the right artists, the right cultural moment, and one man at the center who seemed to have an open channel to the musical pulse of the world. So what does it all mean? Barry Gibb's 4 consecutive #1 hits weren't a fluke. They were the product of relentless work, deep musical instincts, and a rare ability to write for voices other than his own. It's tempting to see the streak as the ultimate career peak, but Barry himself has often said the real reward wasn't the record. It was hearing other artists bring his songs to life. A song is only as good as the person who sings it, he said. In a way, the streak is a time capsule. It captures a moment when one man's songwriting could shape the entire pop landscape, when radio still had the power to crown a king, and when melody was the universal language. Will it ever happen again? Probably not. But maybe that's the point. Some records aren't meant to be broken. They're meant to remind us of what's possible when talent, timing, and pure creative fire all collide. Barry Gibb's record still stands, untouched, unmatched, and unforgettable. What do you think? Could anyone pull this off in today's music industry, or was this a once-in-a-lifetime storm we'll never see again?